Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to this session of Ethics Awareness Week. My name is Brian Birch. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics. But in my role here on the panel, I am a faculty member in the Religious Studies Program here at UVU and have the pleasure of presenting alongside two friends and colleagues of mine who I'll introduce in just a moment. Couple things. The title of our session today is The American Experience with Religious Diversity. And the way in which we're going to format the session is each of us are going to give roughly 15-minute presentations. The goal of that is to help fertilize the soil so that we can have a meaningful conversation and dialogue both between ourselves, but also with the people who are tuning in on YouTube Live. So if you're on the YouTube Live screen, you can see that there's a live chat function. We're going to be taking questions and comments via the live chat. So if something occurs to you that you want to ask the panel, type that in, and we'll be looking at those as we go along, and hopefully we'll be able to field a few of the comments and questions at least. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Guerrero, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the College of William and Mary. She just took up that position after spending the last few years here at Utah Valley University as my colleague in the Department of Philosophy and Humanities. She and I both serve on the Religious Studies Committee alongside Dr. Goode, and she spent 2 years working as the co-advisor to the Interfaith Student Council. So some of you know that UVU is very strongly committed to interreligious dialogue, religious cooperation, and understanding, and Laura's been a very important part of that effort over the last few years. She is currently working on a book, the title of which I will now read. It's an academic title. It's entitled Truth for the Rest of Us, Conventional Truth and Meaning in Buddhist Anti-Realist Philosophy. Did I get that right, Laura? We're delighted that we had the time here with Laura at UVU, and we wish her all the best at William and Mary and all of her new adventures there. Also joining us is Dr. Michael Goode, who, as I mentioned, is a colleague and friend on the Religious Studies Committee here at UVU. He is an associate professor of history, also involved in the Peace and Justice Studies program here on campus. He has been working furiously on a book of his own, the title of which is A Colonizing Peace, subtitled The Quaker Struggle for Gospel Order in Early America. And Michael has been spending quality time in the archives in Philadelphia studying early Quaker movements. So Michael, we're glad to have you. Laura, welcome. The order of presentation this afternoon is going to be Laura, then Michael, and I'll bat cleanup, and then we'll open it up. So without further ado, Laura.
Hello, and thanks for that introduction, Brian. It's really great to be virtually back at UVU with you both. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly here. Oh, maybe I'm not going to share my screen. It's been disabled by the host. Is that something we can fix so I can share my PowerPoint?
Yeah, Evan's working on it.
Okay. I guess I can just start off by saying that I approach the experience of religious diversity in the United States from the perspective of a philosopher working and teaching in the United States in the areas of Asian philosophy. So as I'm also someone who's been actively engaged in the interfaith work. As Brian noted, it was a big part of my time at UVU. And so that's the lens in which I'm coming to this. And what I'm interested in talking about today is thinking about interfaith work as it is presented by Ibu Patel in particular and Diana Eck as a good methodology for trying to be more inclusive in the perspectives we include, not just in our interreligious work, which is the focus of their efforts, but as a good model for thinking about how we should engage, in particular, academic studies of minority and otherwise marginalized voices. So that's the topic of my talk for today. So let's see if I can share my screen now. Aha. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see that now. Michael, can you tell me if you can see it? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so the Asian perspectives and worldviews that I work on have been historically underrepresented, underappreciated, and oftentimes misunderstood in the academic study of philosophy and religious studies, as well as in interfaith exchanges. So this is not news, but I just want to highlight it, that because all of these venues of reflection and engagement have been historically dominated by Euro-American people and traditions who have occupied positions of power politically, socially, economically, oftentimes culturally, minority traditions and perspectives have had to, as a matter of necessity, accommodate and conform to the expectations and conceptual frameworks of that dominant group. So I wanted to use the example of the Salt Lake Buddhist temple to try to illustrate this point. So a little known fact by a lot of folks is that there have been Buddhists in Utah almost as long as there have been Mormons. So these Buddhists came from Japanese descent. They were pioneers. They've been here as long as the late 1800s, and they were mostly manual laborers building railroads and mining. So they helped build the prosperity of the region while experiencing a lot of racial prejudice and discrimination. And part of that also had to do with their religious affiliation, which was Buddhist. So here we have a picture of the Salt Lake Buddhist temple on the left, contrasted with a picture of the Nishi Hojanji temple in Kyoto. So both of these temples are from the same tradition. So the Salt Lake Buddhist temple traces its Buddhist lineage roots back to this group from Japan, but you'll notice a difference in the temples themselves, which I think is indicative of the kinds of things that Buddhists and traditions like the Buddhists have had to deal with in coming to the United States. So the first thing you'll notice about these pictures is that there's pews in the Salt Lake Buddhist temple. And you'll notice that in Kyoto, there are no pews in that temple. So what we see, or what seems evident to me from looking at the way this temple is physically oriented, is that it's trying to look very much like a church, like a Christian church. Also, the Salt Lake Buddhist temple has Sunday school, which is somewhat odd for those from Buddhist traditions in Asia. So Sunday has no special significance for Buddhists in other parts of the world, but it came to be important in marking Buddhist communities in the United States as religious, in a way of trying to legitimize themselves as a religion. So I think the structure of the way the temple has shaped its space is telling of the pressures the group was under in trying to assimilate to their environment, which is a predominantly Christian one. So they're also part of an organization called the Buddhist Churches of America. So while it is true that traditionally religious temples have had affiliation with authoritative lineages of teachers, the idea of having a centralized, organized structure for a church institution is something that you only really see in the American context because of the way in which the dominant churches are also governed through a centralizing, organized, or tend to be. So the LDS Church, for example, has a centralized authority that then has can speak for or can leverage the social capital, we might want to say, of all of their affiliated churches, right? So that centralized organizational structure is something that is foreign to a lot of Buddhist traditions, for example, and a lot of other Asian traditions too. So Hindus also don't tend to organize their churches this way. So I think that when we see the kinds of things that these traditions are doing in order to look more like what the churches in the places that they are rooted in now are, is telling of the kinds of pressures that these places are under for legitimacy. So they are, in some sense, cloaking what they would normally do to try to look more mainstream. So they want to look what Christians expect a religion to look like in order to get to be taken seriously as religions. And I think something happens similarly in the academic realm as well. So for the more traditions from outside the West look like Western traditions, the more recognition they receive by those Western-minded folks in the academy as well. So those Western-minded folks that are the ones that are in power, there is pressure to hide those aspects of one's tradition that mirror aspects of the West, or try to articulate them or frame them or reshape them, as we see, for example, in the very space of the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple, to look and accommodate in the expectations of the dominant group. So of course, there is a natural transformation of religious traditions as they grow roots in new places. That's as old as religion itself. So as religions migrate, they change, that's natural. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the kind of violence that the unequal and discriminatory power dynamics of these spaces do to the traditions that are pressured to present themselves in ways palatable to those to whom their legitimacy depends. So how much of these changes are sort of like organic and how much of them are pressured? And what kind of violence does that do to the traditions? So I think this is something that has historically been a problem. I don't think I'm saying anything new. But the question is, well, how do we, in recognition of that history and those kinds of pressures, how do we move forward in order to do this in a way that can help mitigate the forces that have done perhaps this kind of violence to these traditions? How do we make space for them? So just really quickly, I want to highlight a couple frames of reference of how to think about this. So one scholar who has written about this in terms of cosmopolitanism is Kwame Anthony Appiah, and he writes about this vision of what he calls cosmopolitanism, which is this idea that we can bring people together across differences out of respect for one another. And one of the nice things about his position is that he says, and this is on the slide, that humanity isn't in the relevant sense an identity at all. Engagement with strangers is always going to be engagement with particular strangers. So his version of cosmopolitanism says that yes, like other cosmopolitanisms, we need to have universal respect for humanity. But on his account, which I think he calls partial cosmopolitanism, it's important that in order to respect people's humanity, we also have to respect their particularity. That humans aren't generic, they're particular. They're embedded in cultural, historical contexts that give them distinctiveness. And so part of what it is to respect a person is to respect that particularity, right? So we don't want to erase that. And so he proposes this norm or this value of cosmopolitanism. He's in his book called Cosmopolitanism, he sort of encourages all to be cosmopolitan, to accept particularity while respecting universal human dignity. So he says, in doing this, that I am urging that we should learn about people in other places, take an interest in their civilizations, their arguments, their errors, their achievements, not because that will bring us to agreement, but because it will help us get used to one another. Understanding one another may be hard. It certainly can certainly be interesting, but it doesn't require that we come to agreement. So one of the nice things about what he emphasizes in his cosmopolitanism is this idea that we don't have to agree with one another. We don't have to be relativists and just say everything is right. But across that genuine difference, we can still engage in respect with one another. So I think that kind of a model, this idea of accepting genuine difference and disagreement and deciding that we still want to engage for the common good, to share civil community with one another, is an important value as we think about, for example, what it is to be American, like one out of many. So I think this is a good way to think about moving forward when we're trying to engage across lines of difference. So one of the things that Appiah doesn't talk much about, but that Eck and Patel do, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is about engaging diversity. So diversity, as Eck and Patel describe it, is just a fact about our existence. It's just a diverse people, but we can engage across those lines of difference in various different ways. So we can, one reaction to diversity is just to exclude other people. And we can do this in various ways, by isolating ourselves in bunkers, by drawing barriers between us, emphasizing our difference and then excluding one another. And of course, this can have violent, and has historically in some places, generated violent suppression, right? So pushing down views that are different from ourselves. Another way to engage diversity is through assimilation. And the problem with this, even though it might be well-meaning, is that assimilating different views to a dominant group, which is what basically assimilation ends up being, is what does that kind of violence that I was talking about in the case of the Salt Lake Buddhist temple. That what we're doing is that we're disregarding or ignoring or being indifferent to the differences and the distinctive features of a particular tradition that are important to those members of the tradition because they don't look like us. We say, we will accept you if you can make yourself look more in a way that is comfortable for the dominant group. So that assimilation might sound like the melting pot idea, might sound nice, but what it actually does is ignore those differences that Appiah was saying in his articulation of cosmopolitanism is important for us to show respect to another. We have to acknowledge the particularities of their traditions. So those are two sort of general ways of reacting to diversity that don't really get us the kind of positive engagement that we would like to have with diversity. And that positive engagement gets articulated by Diana Eck and Eboo Patel as pluralism. So Eboo Patel talks about pluralism as an achievement, a positive and constructive way of engaging diversity through respecting identities, building relationships, and cultivating a commitment to the common good. So like Appiah, he's going to emphasize, or does emphasize, the idea that we have to respect particularities, we have to differences where they occur, not gloss over them. But despite those differences, find common ground, common values that we can then leverage to build the common good. And this is the kind of thing for any of you guys who are listening, who are at all involved with the Interfaith Student Council at UVU, this is the kind of pluralism that those students are working very hard to try to cultivate on UVU's campus, for example. This idea that we can have difference, but we can still leverage common values towards a common good. So that's the kind of framework that I think is a good framework for trying to think about how we engage in these in diversity, how we include more voices at our table, is again focusing on respecting and acknowledging difference and particularity. Diane Eck says something similar, so I don't want to talk too long, so I'll just read this quote. So she says that in addition to building our bridges, we will have to find the tables where we might articulate our faith and our commitment sincerely and without illusion about our differences. It is not a matter of finding common faith that is acceptable to all, watering down one's own faith so it will be palatable to someone of another faith. Far from it. It is rather a matter of engaging the diverse faiths in the challenges of building a society of neighbors rather than strangers. It is a matter of finding the tables in our civic, public, and private lives where we can meet. So again, what brings everybody to the table? What makes somebody included at that table is simply just the desire, the commitment to what Appiah was talking about, cosmopolitanism, the idea of wanting to respect other people while respecting particularity. But then once we get to the table, there is no one perspective or one methodology or one mark of legitimacy that's going to say you belong or you don't belong. Everybody gets to show up with whatever particularities are important and distinctive to them, and everybody at the table gets to decide for themselves how to present themselves at that table. And if we have a table where everybody is genuinely open to the particularities that a group brings, then people can bring their authentic, genuine selves. So one of the things I worry about engagement where we have sort of boundaries, methodological boundaries, legitimacy boundaries, is that what we end up getting is traditions that have edited themselves to try to fit a particular kind of mold. And we're missing out on the distinctive features of those traditions that they would otherwise present if the dominant forces were more open to those particularities. So I would like to suggest that this is a really good model for not only engaging in religious diversity, so at interfaith engagements, that if the folks who are engaging in interfaith are adopting this kind of model, that it makes it easier for minority and otherwise marginalized voices to show up and bring their authentic selves to the table, which I think is a good thing. And I'd like to suggest that this similar model might also be fruitful to use in academic circles when we're thinking about who's included and who's not included, when we're talking about what is it to be a religion, how we engage in religious studies, what constitutes a philosophy, and how philosophy is conducted methodologically. So instead of sort of deciding ahead of time, these are the boundaries, and then deciding who to let in, I'm suggesting instead we let everybody come to the table, see what everybody has to say, and then determine from those voices how to think and understand of the various different ways that religions and philosophies can show up. And I think if we're able to allow for more of these, include more of these voices, then we stand to learn a lot more from the unique perspectives that these different groups can bring. So that's it. Thank you. Hopefully that was about 15 minutes, fine, sorry.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to thank Brian and the Ethics Center for inviting me onto the panel. I think it's a wonderful panel, and I'm really not speaking as a philosopher, but rather an historian. And I just want to take off start with, as a jumping off point, Laura's invocation of Eboo Patel's framing of pluralism as an achievement, which I think is really important, and the importance of engagement. And this is, of course, like ethically, I fully endorse interfaith dialogue and interreligious engagement and pluralism, embracing pluralism as a the foundation for sort of democratic engagement and what I would call peace building. How do you think about this as an historian, though, is trickier, because pluralism is not an achievement historically, or I wouldn't frame it as an achievement. One way of thinking about early American history, which is my field, particularly I focus on the British Empire, North America in the 17th and 18th centuries. And there, the fundamental fact, of course, is that North America was a religiously diverse space, and it has always been the case. But the fact of religious pluralism doesn't appear as so much of an achievement as a problem. And I mean that, by that I mean pluralism is something that through colonization or the attempts to erect either de facto or legal religious establishments, many Protestant Anglo-American groups attempted to stamp out religious pluralism in one way or another, and to, in its place, to try to enact a form of religious uniformity. And so underpinning, of course, attempts to establish any sort of religious system embedded in legal and social practices is of course, the specter of religious pluralism underpinning the colonial experience. And so I'm, in my thinking about, how can an historian sort of contribute to the conversation, I look back to just the current environment. A lot of Americans may speak of or project back onto the past to sort of a fantasy of what a religious peace would look like. And sort of, I think different types of groups have different, in the United States, have different ideas of what that golden age looks like. So if you take, for example, debates over the First Amendment. In the First Amendment, you have, of course, a free exercise clause in which conservatives champion because it emphasizes the freedom to practice your religion. And you have an establishment clause in the same amendment. And that, of course, is something that liberals champion because it creates what Thomas Jefferson, at least in his 1802 letter to Danbury Baptists, was in his phrase, the wall of separation, which was the wording, of course, doesn't appear in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the First Amendment, but it subsequently in the 19th, but really in the 20th, it's really a 20th century interpretation of the First Amendment that is now championed by liberals. And in each group, I think, projects sort of particular fantasy back to some imagined past. And so for liberals, I think the wall of separation, they can point to, like, say, Thomas Jefferson. You could point to my own academic work looks at the Quaker colonization of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, Maryland, Rhode Island had toleration acts, and sometimes these pieces of legislation are held up as early exemplars of tolerance, and they are seen or championed as exemplars of the American experiment. And it says, at least in one reading of this, that says something about the American character of tolerance. And of course, this is historically, it's a lot more complicated than that. There was no wall of separation. And in fact, the reading of the First Amendment, of course, is that Congress shall not make or establish or the Congress is not going to, create a religious establishment, but it left the door open for states to maintain religious establishments of one form or another. And the reality is that goes back to the early colonial period. So with the founding of many colonies, there have been many attempts to form some form of religious establishment. And that means that religion has always been intertwined in public life. As I mentioned before, these Protestant establishments, the goal was to establish an idea of religious uniformity. And this is where I think then pluralism isn't so much historically an achievement as it is a problem. Because how do you create a religiously uniform colony in 17th to 18th century America or North America, when the reality is, even within Anglo-American Protestant Christianity, there was a wide range of religious groups, many of whom detested each other and regarded them, their rivals, as heretical as non-Christian groups. And that's not speaking, of course, of other religious traditions that even predate the 19th century that are non-Christian. And so you have these Protestant establishments in the 17th and 18th centuries that extend into the modern period after the American Revolution. They're maintained different ways. So the most famous example, of course, are the Puritan colonies in New England. Technically, Puritan, so Massachusetts Bay, for example, was not a theocracy. So ministers were prohibited from holding public offices, but they still, of course, maintained a religious establishment. And I think Puritans get a bad reputation. They're nowadays, I think people, because of Arthur Miller and The Crucible and other sort of popular media, Puritans are sort of seen as extremely violent, but they were sort of enforcing a religious establishment in ways that mirrored many other colonies. And that's using the power of the state to support a particular church establishment through taxes, through the enactment of morals laws. That includes laws that mandated the observance of the Sabbath. And it could also include laws that don't, at the first blush, seem to have anything to do with religion. So even colonies that are icons of religious toleration, take Pennsylvania, for example, very famously established, religious toleration was a constitutional feature of the founding of Pennsylvania. And Quakers are credited that this is for creating this constitutional culture in Pennsylvania because of their religious pacifism, of their own experience as religious dissenters of persecution. And so they're celebrated in many cases as a group that was for religious, on grounds of religious principle, did not want to mandate religious observance in public life because they would have seen it as violent. Yet even the Quakers, if you want to think of them on the left wing of the spectrum of Anglo-American religious traditions, also maintain their own religious establishments, even in a system of toleration. And that looked like laws that mandated that office holders had to be Christian, so non-Christians were excluded. So early Jewish immigration to North America, those Jewish migrants would have been excluded from public office. Even things like, in the case of Pennsylvania, the lack of a militia. So Pennsylvania, by constitutional design, was founded as a colony that did not have a provincial militia established. It was left to the subjects of the colony, the colonial subjects, to establish their own private militia companies. That seems like a civic issue at first blush, but it's actually also intersects with a religious issue, because the very reason that the Quaker government, Quaker-dominated government in Pennsylvania did not want a religious, or did not want to establish a militia, is to allow pacifist Quakers the freedom to not muster for a militia or pay war taxes. But in the 18th century, as you get more Scotch-Irish, German, English immigrants who are Anglican or coming from other religious traditions who are not pacifists, they chafe under this lack of a religious, or I'm sorry, a lack of a militia, and begin to attack the Quaker movement in public. And so you have these debates, especially during times where, say, during the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and early 1760s, the frontier of the colony in Indian country, there are attacks. Different displaced native groups begin attacking colonial settlements. And so there's great demand for the organization of a provincial militia. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the print debate quickly turns into a religious debate. And it sort of unveils the religious underpinnings of seemingly civic issues, such as pacifism or militia service. And I think the point here is that whether you're looking at Puritan colonies that are more famously understood to be religious establishments, or colonies that had instituted toleration and are sort of celebrated now as exemplars of tolerance, but in fact are creating establishments, some sort of religious ordering that underpinning that, I would argue, are attempts to create a sense of the religious peace. And that religious peace then is the foundation upon which the civic order, the civic peace rests. And the linchpin of this, of course, is the understanding that you have to have some form of religious uniformity. And what that religious uniformity looked like depended on, of course, the particular historical circumstance. It could be a Quaker version of religious uniformity, which could have been a pacifist policy in the colony with no militia. It could have been a Puritan form of religious uniformity, or an Anglican form of religious uniformity. All of these different forms of religious uniformity, of course, create others. They make, because again, early colonial North America is a place of religious pluralism, is a place of religious diversity. Then when you create religious establishments that attempt to create some semblance of uniformity, invariably you create others. You create, either legally or in a de facto sense, religious dissenters. So for, say, American conservatives today, that when they look back to a sort of a golden age in which I think language, sometimes you hear, America has always been a Christian nation, for example. Well, it took force and violence to create this illusion. And there are many examples of this, but two major ones that in 17th and 18th century North America that deal with non-Christian religious peoples, one of which is surprisingly Islam. So Islam in America has a history that goes back 400 years. It runs along the Atlantic slave trade simultaneously. So the development of, or the presence of Islam in America runs alongside the Atlantic slave trade. Scholars estimate maybe perhaps 30% of enslaved Africans that were brought to North America from West and Central Africa were Muslim. And of course, this is not counting other indigenous African religious traditions that were also brought to North America. To some extent, scholars are still trying to puzzle together how much did African Islamic practices or African indigenous religious traditions survived the slave trade. It's still something that we're piecing together, because a lot of these practices were driven underground, and it was driven underground because, of course, colonial religious establishments could not tolerate them, and slavery itself as an institution did great damage to these systems. And of course, then African religious traditions then changed. They creolized and adapted to Christianity, but they still in some ways intertwined with older systems and created sort of Creole practices that contributed to the fundamental fact of this pluralistic landscape. And of course, you cannot talk about religious pluralism and the presence of even non-Christian peoples without talking about Native Americans. And so in the 17th and 18th centuries, right through the American Revolution, most of North America was Indian country. The Anglo-American colonies dominated the Atlantic seaboard, but they did not dominate most of the interior of the continent. And that meant, by definition, that native religious traditions that were grounded in their own sort of practices and indigenous understandings were quite part of the religious plural map of North America. And they continue to survive. And of course, Native people similarly adapted to Christianity and blended Christianity with Indian religious worldviews, primarily for Native ends. And again, why some of this history is missing, or it's not, is why it doesn't occupy the public consciousness as much as it could, is that, of course, pre-revolutionary colonial and the U.S. government in the 19th and even 20th centuries have attempted directly to stamp out Native American religious traditions. And they did this through a policy of assimilationism, through the boarding school movement, but more fundamentally through colonization. Yet Native religious practices adapted and survived. You can see this in the 18th century with Native revivalist movements that blended the language of Christianity, but was rooted in a Indian idiom, a religious idiom that called for the rejection of colonial trade goods, which include the clothes that you wear, alcohol, firearms. There were calls to sort of move Native peoples back to their own sort of imagined sort of golden age before colonization. There's, of course, the ghost dance movement, and in the 19th century and in the 20th and 21st centuries, these attempts to sort of stamp out Native religious practices, both Christian Native religious practices, but also hybrid practices that fuse Christianity with more indigenous frameworks, and even purely Native religious traditions. These survive, of course, into the present age. So I guess the takeaway question is, what's the point? And the point, I think, is that religious pluralism is as much an historical reality as a present day reality. And so how do we then shift from an understanding of pluralism as a problem to what Eboo Patel sort of frames and Laura points out as pluralism as an achievement? In other words, how do we begin to start to understand and make space for each other and make space for underrepresented groups that don't fit the model of the imagined golden past of America has always been a Christian nation, or America looks like a particular vision of a Christian nation. And I guess as an historian, there's only one I think I would sort of add is that there has to be a reckoning. Part of the work of interfaith dialogue, I think, has to be an historical reckoning of not only religious pluralism as a reality, but also just the long history in which the attempts to create a religious uniform order, primarily in North America, in the British Empire and in the United States. This is a particular vision of a Protestant Christian order, how that has created multiple sort of others. And this is a long history, of course, added onto the history of what happens to indigenous African and Native American religious systems through slavery and colonization. And there's a lot of reckoning, historical reckoning to do, I think, that then might sort of bridge towards looking at interfaith work as an act of peace building, which means not only learning how to accommodate, but also to learn how to live and work amongst people of different religious traditions and be able to respect them, to create spaces that if we're going to live in a real civic democracy, and you're going to have not only a racially inclusive civic space, but also a religiously inclusive space. And so I think we're going to have to sort of contend with these histories that don't fit quite either the liberal narrative of a country that is champion toleration, or of course or another narrative which champions the idea of Christianity being sort of an uncontested and simple presence, almost timeless, in the 17th, 18th centuries through the founding and of course to the present day.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate what both of you have said, and my remarks are going to be kind of constellation of certain themes that we've talked about, and perhaps add some additional fertilizer was the image I was looking for, to the soil of our discussion. So I really enjoyed contrasting the idea of pluralism as an achievement and pluralism as a problem, or the specter of pluralism, because that's a nice segue into some of what I'm going to say in my remarks. The way I'm going to frame my presentation is in terms of three myths related to religious diversity. And so I'm going to try to generate conversation by contesting some commonly held views of the United States and how religion functions in the United States. And the first myth I want to point to is this idea that the United States is the most religiously diverse country in the world. And Laura had referenced Diana Eck, who published a landmark book in 2002 entitled A New Religious America. And that was one of the key arguments that Eck made in that work, was the idea that the US is the most religiously diverse country in the world. Her book was met with immediate challenge from a variety of quarters who sought to call into question that claim And so a whole conversation ensued about what do we mean by religious diversity? How do we identify religious groups? What counts as a religion or doesn't count as a religion? So I want to spend just a few minutes throwing some facts out on the table to perhaps complexify the situation in the US. And the next few slides are going to be an amalgamation of different studies that have been published since roughly 2007 or 2008 by the Pew Center and other reputable organizations. Right. So the first thing that we need to contend with is the idea that 95% of the US population is either Christian or unaffiliated. All other religions combined account for just 5% of the American population. And as a result of this, the United States ranks 68th out of 232 countries and territories on what they refer to as the Religious Diversity Index. And this index was created, it was a kind of complex compilation of different factors in order to really understand the shape of religious difference and religious unity across the globe. And so the slide you're looking at now is the kind of spectrum of the different countries that were part of it. So this is a kind of snapshot. So according to this Pew study, Singapore is the most religiously diverse country in the world. If you bring all of the different forms of Christianity, all of the different forms of Buddhism, all of the different forms of Islam and Hinduism under one umbrella. And so if you slice up the pie in that way, Singapore would be the most religiously diverse country. Iran would register as the least diverse country in the world, given the high concentration of Islam with a very few number of religious minorities. Right, the United States ranks in the middle of this in this study, given the high concentration of people that still self-identify as Christian. Right, the second most populous group would be the unaffiliated, then Catholics and evangelical Protestants, right, are roughly in the same area. This slide talks about what is arguably the most important dynamic in American religious life over the last 25 or 30 years, and that is the growth of religious disaffiliation. And most of you have heard of this idea that the highest rates of growth occur within this category called the religious nones, N-O-N-E, right? And that name is taken from a survey question in which there was a category in which a person could check none of the above. Right, so it had Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, et cetera, right? More people click none of the above in studies that began roughly around 1995 than at any time before then. And so researchers have been tracking the growth rates of what they call the disaffiliated category. And of course, this can be subdivided into atheist, agnostic, this category that we call spiritual but not religious, disaffiliated, et cetera, et cetera. If you compare the rates of growth of this category to previous generations, which is what you're looking at now, you can see that the growth of this category has risen dramatically over the last 60 to 75 years. So the younger the population, the greater the disaffiliation and disconnection with organized religion, where you can see with the millennials, they register in at about 42.7% disaffiliation. So that is a dynamic that we all have to wrap our minds around when we're trying to understand the idea of the contemporary scene, right, as one of, the predominance of Christianity, right? It is still the case that Christianity and Protestant Christianity is the most dominant form of religious self-identity, but it is shrinking at a rate that is far more rapid than we've seen in the past 5 or 6 generations. Another thing that I thought would be of interest is this phenomenon which which researchers call the feeling thermometer. And this came out of a study in 2006, a Faith Matters study, which informed the really important book from David Campbell and Robert Putnam entitled American Grace. And this attempts to drill into the data a little bit more deeply to give the reader a sense for how different religious groups feel toward other religious groups, or what is their immediate or more visceral reaction to other religious groups. And you can see that that the most highly respected groups in this study, right, are people who self-identify as Jewish, people who self-identify as Catholic, and mainline Protestants. And that's interesting given the history of religious diversity in the US, right? Because anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism have been really important features of the religious conflicts historically. And yet, when people are questioned about the groups they most admire or they immediately connect with, both Jews and Catholics are in this category. You can see in the middle part are evangelical Christians and people who self-identify as non-religious. And interestingly, at the bottom of the feeling thermometer are 3 groups, right? Mormons or Latter-day Saints, Buddhists, and Muslims. And when I first read this study, the most interesting or surprising part of it was where Buddhism landed, right? I would have guessed that Buddhists would be much higher on the feeling thermometer than they were, and I would have put them far ahead of both Latter-day Saints and Muslims, right? Given my sense for the religious landscape. So maybe Laura can shed a little light on that phenomenon. So if you look at this in numeric form, I've just broken this down in terms of how groups respond to one another. And I put in red some of the most striking parts of this study. So some of this is predictable. You can see that evangelical Protestants and people who self-identify as atheists, right? There's a very low sense of feeling, right? Warmth of feeling, if you will. And then you can see also not only how groups feel about other groups, but also how they feel about themselves. And another striking feature of this is the extent to which Mormons or Latter-day Saints, right, like themselves, feel a warmth toward their own group. Some of that is accounted for in terms of just the group cohesion that is present within the Latter-day Saint community, given the historic marginalization and discrimination. This group has identified in many respects as an ethnicity as much as it is a religion. So there's much more cohesiveness than there is, say, between mainline Protestantism or even evangelical Protestantism. So here's some of the key takeaways from this idea of diversity. There's an overall movement away from organized religion, which is obvious in all the studies. 34% of American adults currently have a religious identity different from the one in which they were raised. So this speaks to this idea of generational replacement, where children are not as actively engaged in the religious communities as their parents, and moving much more toward the category of disaffiliation. As we mentioned before, approximately 42% of young millennials and Generation Z are unaffiliated. Though non-Christian groups are growing, so if you look at growth rates, right, they are growing at a faster rate than mainline Protestants, and in some respects even evangelical Protestants. But in terms of the overall percentage of the population, they represent less than 10%, roughly, depending on which study, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7%. Another fact that I found of interest is this idea that there are 20 states in the country in which no religious group comprises a greater share of the residents than people who are religiously unaffiliated. And so the idea that there are concentrated parts of the country where there is a predominance of one religious group is fading. It is still the case that certain regions have more of a predominance, but the trends are certainly moving away from that. The second myth that I want to call your attention to is something that Michael had talked about, right? And that's the myth that the early Puritans, right, the Pilgrims, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right, and other early Christian settlers were escaping from religious persecution in the pursuit of individual religious freedom. And this provides the occasion for us to talk about a really important distinction between individual religious freedom and what you can call communal or group religious freedom. And when people talk about religious freedom in the US, they often conflate those two. They will be talking about individual religious freedom when the history of the country, as Michael pointed out, was much more oriented toward communal forms of religious freedom. So the early Puritans, right, they were, the Massachusetts Bay Colony especially, right, they were indeed persecuted in England. They had to practice their religion underground in some cases. They fled to North America to create an ideal religious community, or what they understood to be a Christian commonwealth. And so within this community, there were incredible forms of intolerance and persecution, corporal punishment, right, and other forms of discrimination. And the episode that took place right early in the colonial period between Roger Williams, who was a dissenter in response to that intolerance, and the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, led by John Cotton, is an interesting case study of the conflict between the individual forms of freedom that Roger Williams and his followers sought, and the attempt to preserve an ideal Christian society, which is what you see with John Cotton and some of Roger Williams' critics in the colonies. And the point of this is to show that from a very early period in the history of North American religion, at least in terms of the colonization of North America, that individual forms of freedom and communal forms of freedom have been in tension. And they've been in tension throughout the entire history of the American religious situation, both prior to the framers of the Constitution and obviously thereafter. So this slide here just takes us back to a period even before the Massachusetts Bay Colony, when there was a small community established by French Protestants in Florida and they were attempting to practice their own form of religious freedom when the Spanish decided that they were going to venture into that part of the region and slaughtered all the inhabitants of Fort Caroline. And you see a quote taken from one of the leaders of that movement saying that we hanged all those we had found in the fort because they were scattering the odious Lutheran doctrine in these provinces. So when you look at the earliest encounters of religious groups in the American experiment, both prior to the Puritans and the Pilgrims and afterward, it is a scene, as Michael describes, of conflict, of tension, and in many cases, heroism, right, in the face of very low odds. This is something that was taken from Governor John Endicott in response to the execution of Quakers in 1659. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the early Quakers, and Michael can help amplify or correct this, is the idea that the Quakers are seen today, right, as the peace-loving, right, generally progressive Christian group, where historically and in their roots, they were very much a proselytization community, right? They were out engaging in different forms of missionary work, seeking converts, and were relatively disruptive in the societies in which they were preaching. And so a lot of people will point back to these events that happened in 1659, in which a handful of Quakers were executed from the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But it was only after, at least from the standpoint of Endicott and other leaders, it was only after they had pleaded with the Quakers to stay away and to not come back. And so there were repeated attempts by the Quakers to enter the community, to preach, to being banished and returning, and finally they were executed. Okay, so I want to just talk briefly so we can have some time for questions about the third myth, which is the idea that religious conflicts can be settled by simply adopting a live and let live attitude. And the key point here is that in the cases of religious conflict, what it means for someone to live out their religious identity may directly come into conflict with how somebody else understands them living out their religiosity or lack thereof. And so this whole idea of individuals peaceably living side by side is a beautiful ideal. But even that perception or that approach presupposes a kind of individualized, privatized form of religion that is seen in Protestant Christianity. And so one of the ways in which the history of the United States is one of the domination of Protestant categories and sensibilities, this is one of them, right? The idea that the way to solve religious conflict is to privatize religion, right? Allow individuals religious freedom, and then not deal with religion in a healthy and constructive way on the social level. And in my judgment, that's a simplified view because people believe that in order for them to fully practice or engage in the free exercise of religion, to refer back to the First Amendment language, means that they need to conduct themselves both in public and in private in ways that may conflict with someone else. And that's just one of the harsh realities of a pluralistic society or a diverse society trying to navigate and negotiate space for people to be able to balance, right, their individual religious freedom and their individual conscience with maintaining, right, a broader social order, right, and set of values that may, in some cases, come into conflict with one religious group or another. Okay, so with that said, I will stop there and we can open it up for questions. Laura or Michael, do you have anything that you want to say in response to what the others have said?
Yeah, I did want to respond a little bit to Michael in this idea about pluralism not being an achievement. And I think maybe he misunderstood me or I wasn't clear that by saying that pluralism is an achievement, I was precisely meaning it. And I think Eck and Patel also mean it in the sense that we can't take it for granted. So why it's important to differentiate between diversity and pluralism is the diversity is just a fact. Like, we live in diverse communities, but that's neither good or bad. The question is, how do we engage that diversity? And what I was trying to get at with that list is that there's lots of different ways that people engage diversity. And I think you outlined really nicely many of the historical ways that diversity has been approached that have not necessarily led to peaceful and cohabitation with diverse others. They've led to conflict. So the question is, how do we engage diversity in ways? Is it possible to engage diversities in ways that don't lead to conflict? And I think that for a lot of people who might think negatively about religion generally, think that they look at this kind of history and they say the only way to have religious peace is, like you mentioned, is for everybody to be of the same religion. That as soon as you get like two different people, different religions, that it automatically is going to mean no peace, right? So the question is that true? I mean, is it possible to have religious diversity in in a community, within a community, and still be able to engage one another in full acknowledgement of the differences? Like, so it's not like a glossing over of differences, and still be able to find some sort of common values you can leverage towards a common good. So, but when I said that pluralism is an achievement, I meant to emphasize that it's hard, that you don't get it for free, that you actually have to do some work to get it. And while there's definitely a lot of historical examples when religious communities have not successfully been able to foster pluralism, I think there's also examples where they have. And I'm sort of beating myself up because I was trying to think of a good one. Maybe, Brian, you have a better one off the top of your head. But I was thinking about oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking. But anyway, the point I'm trying to say is that is it inevitable that if you get religious diversity, you're going to have conflict? And I think the answer is no. It just depends on how you engage that diversity and whether you So the question is, how do we do that? And so I think Eck and Patel are trying to give a methodology for how you go from diversity to pluralism and avoid some of the other bad things that might happen by engaging diversity in other ways.
Michael.
Yeah, I might have misspoke, actually. I didn't mean to imply that Laura was speaking or using Patel as a way to speak of an achievement that religious pluralism has been, or at least interfaith engagement has been achieved as a fact on the ground, but rather I think I was trying to point to the spirit in which the sort of framing of religious pluralism as an achievement is not something that's happened. In fact, that we live in the American culture that we live in is not one in which religious pluralism is embraced as a fact on the ground, but more, I think it points to the idea of it being a moral good, and that inclusivity is a moral good. And I think I take that as an important part of peace building work, is this kind of interfaith dialogue interreligious engagement, so that there is the fact and reality of pluralism is something that can be embraced rather than rejected. I guess my point in shifting it is just to think about in history, as Laura mentioned, religious pluralism is a fact, and that it's a fact even in the 18th and 17th centuries.
Diversity, you mean?
Yeah, diversity. Yeah, religious diversity is a fact in the early colonial era as much as it is now. I think sometimes it's forgotten in some ways because in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries we have so much more immigration from different areas of the world coming to the United States, and with that comes, and including Pacific world immigration, and with the rise of that kind of immigration, you see just invariably more religious diversity. So it might be, I think in the back of my mind, I think that there is a temptation to see the pre-revolutionary past as being less diverse in some ways because the immigration wasn't quite so global. But in fact, the reality is much different. That the religious pluralism was just as much a fact on the ground as it is today. And so, of course, the historical issue is how you frame this as a problem. And Brian, is it okay if I wanted to respond actually to something you
Please, absolutely.
mentioned? Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was really intrigued by I wrote it down. The idea that the sort of statistical reality that the United States is ranked 68th in religious diversity. And did you say, I think, what, 90%? Is it 90% of the population of the United States identifies either as Christian or unaffiliated?
It was 95.
95, yeah. And, again, the historical legacy, I have to point to, again, the Atlantic slave trade and colonization, sort of the specter of that helps create that reality in some ways, because with Atlantic slavery, you have the introduction of African Muslim practices and indigenous African practices, but they are driven underground and forced to adapt in ways that are often hidden to us. And then, of course, Native American religious practices that were either displaced, driven underground, or forced to adapt. And that, I think, always has to be remembered as part of the, whenever we want to talk about just sort of the lack of religious diversity. If the United States is not as religiously diverse as Singapore, for example, well, depending on how we define what constitutes a religion, for one thing, but take that for granted. I mean, colonization and Atlantic slavery have left long legacies for the way in which the United States is constructed in a national image as a Protestant Christian nation, and colonization and slavery had a big role in creating that image and maintaining on the ground through different kinds of religious establishments.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I had pointed out that one of the key points of disagreement between Eck and her critics was exactly how religion is identified, not just religion generally, but a religion, and how you connect these groups together. So Eck was relying on a more fragmented form where all the different Christian groups counted as a different religious community, which gave support for her claim, right, that the U.S. is the most diverse. But other religious traditions have equal, if not greater, forms of diversity, where if we accounted for those same kinds of subdivisions within Buddhism or Islam or other traditions, then the situation would look much different. And so even the way in which one conducts these studies, right, there is a kind of a bias, right, toward Christian identity by not recognizing the forms of difference within these other groups. And many, as as many know, just the labels that we give other religious communities are not their own, right? Hinduism, right, is an external label that is attached to a variety of different traditions, and there are other examples as well. So yeah, that's very contestable, very interesting ground, I think, for people who want to drill in more deeply.
And I'll just,
Nope.
oh yeah, I'll just jump in again, just to add, right, even in 17th and 18th century North America, within the realm of Christianity, even within the realm of Protestant Christianity, the range of religious traditions could be quite broad and syncretic. And so, for example, Puritans often employed folk practices and what now in the 21st century we might call magic, elements of folk practices that maybe not be defined traditionally as religious. And, this was part of the Puritan landscape. And, part of what made Quakers, you mentioned the Quakers being seen as progressive, or, Quakers allowed women to preach. And in the 18th century, that was considered radical, and it's even in some circles today, that's still considered radical. But the larger point I want to make is that even within the realm of what we would call Christianity, whether historically or in the present day, there's such a range that you could see multiple levels of pluralism going on within one religious system or one religious tradition. So even Protestant Christianity in the 18th century is enormously complex and contested. And it only looks to a statistician or an observer, say, in the 21st century, looking back, that it gets flattened in some ways because it gets lumped in as, one thing. It's like Protestant Christianity. And we forget, I think, historically, what looks like from our point of view, very minute differences that could turn on, the differences between a Presbyterian form of church government and a Congregationalist form of church government. But at that time, people, murdered each other over it, or inflicted judicial punishments over what they considered heterodoxy in different ways. So again, the question of what constitutes Christianity even is a fraught question.
I saw that there was a question on the chat. Can I answer that real quick? So somebody asked about what are some modern ways religions can interact with each other that are peaceful, and what's the history of it? And I couldn't think of the example at the time, but it occurs to me that the civil rights movement, for example, is a very good example of interfaith engagement, where different people from different religious backgrounds came together out of a shared value for equality and to advocate for the rights of people whose rights were being denied. And so you see lots of great examples of Muslims, Jews, Christians coming together in effort to try to promote that common good, that a shared value that these traditions have. So I think in light of maybe a lot of this is me speaking from my perspective, so those people who are still trying to fight that fight, if that's an important religious value, maybe just what we might want to say, the current civil rights movement that's working with Black Lives Matter might be a really great way to rekindle some of this interfaith engagement towards trying to promote more equitable social and racial practices in the United States. So pick up on the baton that was given by our civil rights forebears and continue that work today. I mean, I think that would be an excellent opportunity for exercising interfaith engagement for the common good.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're out of time. If I can just add something really quickly to that. Study after study shows that the most effective way to break down religious misconceptions and marginalization is through spending time with peoples of other traditions. There is no substitute. There's no book you can read. There's no abstract theory that can substitute for getting to know an individual person from another tradition, right? And that, speaks to Laura's point about the way in which groups can connect toward common cause as being the most effective social way to build bridges and strengthen civil society more generally. So I just want to thank both of you. It's been a pleasure. It just came to my attention a minute ago that my slides didn't even show on the screen, so you had to look at me the entire time, which is unfortunate. So for those who are watching, I'll go ahead and post my slides on the Ethics Awareness Week schedule and also on the YouTube page, just in case you wanted to take a look at those. But again, many thanks to you, Laura and Michael, and I look forward to continued conversation. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.